Hello everyone. Here's another video on the channel. I ask those who haven't subscribed yet to please subscribe, leave a like if you enjoy the content, and share it. If you'd like and are able to support the channel with a symbolic contribution, just click on the join area and feel free to leave a comment in the comments section. Today we're going to talk about internal competitiveness and female comparisons. Why are women so competitive? And why do they compare themselves to each other all the time? This is part of a series of videos I want to make about the 80 characteristics of the so-called weaker sex, the female sex, which Nisar Ranali discusses in his works. I'll leave a link to Nisar Ranali's works in a pinned comment in case anyone isn't familiar with him. Although I believe most people have already heard of him, for those who haven't and just happen to stumble upon this video, I'll leave a link that serves as a sort of Bible for men. You know, Nisar Ranali is kind of a legend, a pseudonym no one really knows his true identity, who wrote several works about the female psyche back in the 2000s. And his works they're available for free download on the internet. So yeah, out of the 80 characteristics he talks about, I'm going to make random videos about them. I'll try to follow the order, but not now. This series of 80 doesn't necessarily mean it'll be done in order here on the channel. I might talk about one today, another in the next video. I might make 3 or 4 videos on other topics and then come back to it. Anyway, we've got all the time in the world. With this average of 3 videos a week on the channel, we'll be able to really go into detail on this. So, talking about 2 characteristics that I think are pretty interconnected and can be discussed together. The first and second out of the 80 he lists, he says that women compare themselves to each other and are highly competitive. It's not at all uncommon to hear women themselves say, even feminists, that female friendships are full of insincerity. They say that women greet each other, give kisses on the cheek, call each other beautiful in photos and all that, but deep down, as soon as someone turns their back, they talk about each other. There are even some memes that show this, and it's pretty real. So it's not some kind of fantasy or a sexist idea or anything like that. It's something you can really see. And even among women themselves, many of them say they prefer to work with men in the workplace instead of women. I'll say, actually, I think everyone has heard someone say that. Although I think in some environments it's actually better to work with women than with men, but that's a topic for another time. Because men also have a competitive side and sometimes try to undercut each other and can be tough at times, right? But that's a topic for another time too. But yeah, getting back to this topic of relationships, incentives, and rewards in the environment, which is the main focus of my channel, where does this issue of competition and comparison among women come from? So, talking about competition first, Coruja de Carvalho, which is a channel I highly recommend, and I'll also leave the link in a pinned comment. Everything I mention here, if I say I'll link to something or reference any material, I'll put it in a pinned comment. So up to now, I've already mentioned the Coruja do Carvalho channel and Nessa Rinaldi's works for download, and I'll share those links later. Yeah, he made a really interesting video where he mentions that a lot of female dissimulation, he studied this topic a lot. I've studied it too, but he's really more in depth on it. Comes from our tribal ancestors. Because before society was organized into large civilizations, even before the advent of agriculture and so on, back in the Paleolithic era and earlier, tribal societies, what happened in those societies? The men, they would wage war. Tribes would fight each other, and the winning tribe would kill all the men from the losing tribe. And the women, they'd end up kidnapping the women for themselves. And the women, for survival. So I see a lot of people, both men and women, judging all sorts of behaviors, flawed or contradictory behaviors in terms of human character. Like cheating is about character, being fake is about character, everything is about character, values and whatever, because people love to romanticize things, to make things more abstract. Not that these things don't exist. Character, values, upbringing, that's a big part of what shapes a person. But this more animalistic, instinctive, survival-driven side ends up being forgotten in a lot of analyses, and a lot of people just ignore it, right? When you ignore biology and the psyche, like that so-called reptilian brain part of humans, So we have a lot of there are a lot of we have a lot of behaviors that are reactive, behaviors that have been present in our DNA for millions of years. So the part about women being dissimulative is also a matter of survival. It's not just about feminism or about being fake or about cultural Marxism, ideology, or blaming capitalism or whatever else people want to blame it on. Part of this also has to do with the issue of survival, with that tribal aspect that Coruja de Carvalho explained really well in his video. Women had to adapt and tell lies so they wouldn't be killed. The new guys who conquered, the dominant tribe that took over the women from the defeated tribe, they had to trust the women, to believe that they had forgotten their ex-husbands, ex-partners who died during the battle, and that now they were going to reproduce, live together, do domestic chores, gathering and all that, hunting too, which both sexes took part in. Women more in gathering, men more in hunting. This varies a lot from civilization to civilization. But yeah, in several tribal societies that were studied, that's how it worked. So the women had to adapt to the new men of the tribe they were integrated into in order to survive, because at the slightest sign of distrust or betrayal, they would end up being killed. So it's an adaptive issue. Nature doesn't have this thing about morals or ethics, nothing like that. It's brutal, and it doesn't care at all. It's completely amoral in that sense. It's not that it's immoral, it's amoral. It's devoid of morality. It's not that it has good or bad morals or anything like that. It just doesn't care about those things. So a lot of this dissimulation by women and this competitive behavior comes from that, because she needed to show to other women, in relation to other women, to the dominant men, that she was the best one there, so he could have offspring, that she was trustworthy in some kind of service, some kind of help, or something like that. So even today, women end up competing with each other. There's this issue that goes back to a survival instinct. However, the world has changed a lot. Today, in most modern civilizations, you don't have this thing of tribes conquering each other, of men stealing another guy's woman by force, and so on. And the competition has changed a bit too, right? Today, competition is usually for the high status man. In a country like Brazil, like we talk about here on the channel, women aim for the top 1 to 3% of men, both in terms of money and looks, because here, besides there being few rich men, there are also few good-looking men. On average, Brazilian men don't meet the standards women are looking for, so they need to compete with each other to go after the best man, even though nowadays many of them are able to support themselves. Women are in the workforce, they earn their own money and all that, but that doesn't stop hypergamy, which is another biological instinct that can be activated or deactivated, or it kind of gets regulated or kept at acceptable levels depending on social behavior, on the current order of things, on religion, morality, on the values of society, and so on. So this exists, yeah, depending on the stimuli present in the environment, the reward stimuli in the environment, you're going to have this issue of hypergamy being more or less pronounced, and right now it's extremely pronounced. And one of the main drivers of this, like I've said many times here on the channel, is Instagram. Because Instagram has made it possible for women to have access to all kinds of alpha men, celebrities, semi-celebrities, millionaires, people they didn't have access to before. So it brought people a lot closer. And also with things like cosmetic procedures, filters, photo angles, and the normalization of sexy photos, like showing off their butts and so on, women have really raised their market value and now compete for the few men at the top. So this issue of competition, besides being something ancestral, it's been around for millions of years in humanity, even before Homo sapiens, back in the days of Australopithecus and so on, Neanderthals, etc. There's also the social factor that intensifies this. So it's a mix of biology and anthropology. Let's put it that way. So the issue of comparison, right, and competition, this is something really primitive, really biological that's always existed. There's a survival instinct behind this. Because literally, when a woman was considered inferior to other women, she would end up being killed in tribal societies in the past. So even today, there's still this need to compete with other women and show that she's better in order to attract a man's attention, even if they say they hate men, don't want to be mothers, and so on. Their biology still speaks very loudly. It's millions of years of evolution. So there's no point in coming with that kind of talk, even if they say they don't want it, because deep down, the overwhelming majority of them do want that dream monogamy and to have beautiful, healthy children with the best genes possible. No matter how much they deny it anyway, the woman's speech is one thing, but her loneliness and depression are another. But the issue of comparison, and especially physical comparison, women don't really compare themselves intellectually that much. Even though there's all this talk encouraging women to value intelligence and everything, in the end, they end up comparing themselves physically. Anyway, women talk as if it's men's fault, blaming the so called beauty standards and all that, but they're the ones who set these unattainable standards and give attention to influencers and so on. Yeah, so this whole issue of comparison, why does this happen so much? Anyone who's ever dated or is dating knows that sooner or later your girlfriend will ask, "Hey, do you think that girl is pretty? You think that girl's body's nice? What'd you think of her hair? Do you think I should dye my hair like that? Did you like these nails here?" So they're constantly comparing themselves because they see something that catches their eye in this big human showcase that is Instagram. They're going to end up seeing other women with more toned, more attractive bodies than theirs. Not to mention the whole thing about interest in lives and all that. But today I don't want to talk about that life aspect. I want to focus on this angle of comparison itself. So they're inevitably going to end up comparing themselves to each other. It's also something unavoidable. And why is that? Because they need to always be desired. Women have an overwhelming need to always have their ego validated. And the easiest, quickest, and most natural way for them to validate their ego is through physical beauty. If a woman spends her time reading Russian literature and posting analysis, unless she's really beautiful, but if she's average looking or unattractive and keeps posting that stuff, it's going to get a very low audience. So there are already a bunch of memes and comparison figures about this, and honestly, it's kind of sad. Sometimes a girl has an extraordinary talent for painting, for a certain art. She's a good actress and a great writer, writes poetry and all that. But if she's not pretty, no one will pay attention. But the mistake is saying that it's men who create this beauty dictatorship, especially in a country like Brazil, where 80% of men are completely uninteresting and invisible to women. What beauty standard are these guys even setting? They don't get to choose. Most men in Brazil are poor or unattractive and needy, right? The first woman who's a 2 out of 10 that shows any interest ends up hooking them, right? Because these guys are needy. They rarely have women and they live in a sexual desert. So women get involved with a handful of bad boys and start thinking that Brazil is full of 6 foot tall players with six-pack abs who make 50,000 reais a month. And then they say the men are no good, that there aren't enough men out there, and so on. Anyway, that same old nonsense we're used to hearing all the time. But anyway, just to wrap up the video, folks, the first two topics about feminine traits that are, in a way, kind of forbidden to talk about when it comes to the so-called weaker sex in mainstream media are this issue of competition and comparison. So women compete with each other for primitive biological reasons, to always have the trust of the best, most dominant men. Yeah, and they also compare themselves to each other so they can always be desired and have the best possible attributes. Because if they see a blogger, a beautiful woman, a model, or an actress being extremely desired, with lots of men saying she's gorgeous, she's hot, and so on, they're always going to want to look as much like that kind of woman as possible. So pay attention to these behaviors, because they don't come from where they say they do. It's not men who create this. It's not a patriarchal society that creates this or anything like that. Even though the issue of competitiveness does relate to some patriarchal societies, just so you don't say I'm contradicting myself, there are some matriarchal societies, especially in Africa, in Nigeria, where you still have matriarchal societies. There have also been some other types of indigenous societies that were more matriarchal, where women had this competitiveness among themselves, even to compete for the men of the tribe. So this happens regardless of whether the society's more patriarchal or more matriarchal. Yeah, there's even a book. I haven't read it yet, but I saw an analysis of it. It's a book I'm actually planning to buy. I don't think it's available in Brazil, so I have to buy it from abroad or get it on Kindle. It talks about this, I think it was Sex and Culture or something like that. Sex Culture. I can't remember the exact name right now, but it's a book from 1934 where a guy studied 94 civilizations where women were more dominant, where they were more matriarchal. He identified patterns of collapse there. Yeah, overall in those societies. So, yeah, there are some indications that show that regardless of whether it's a patriarchy or a matriarchy, this competition is going to exist, and the comparison is mostly about looks, okay? A big warm hug to each and every one of you watching today.